Okay. Let's get started. It looks like the numbers have slowed down to enter the room. So first of all, welcome to two From Pain to Impact, 3 Stories of Resilience. We're so glad you've joined us today to hear from 3 remarkable individuals whose experiences remind us that even life's most difficult moments can become a source of purpose, hope, and positive change. I'll introduce our speakers momentarily, and those folks are going to be Dimple Balia, Dan Lukasik, and Zeno Temple in just a moment. So today's program is a little different from our typical format. Rather than a traditional panel discussion, each speaker will have the opportunity to share their story individually, allowing us to better understand their personal journey, the challenges they faced, and how those experiences shape the work they do today. This program, this program grew from a simple truth. Many lawyers and legal professionals experience profound challenges throughout their careers and lives. Those challenges may include vicarious trauma, moral injury, grief, depression, anxiety, or periods of feeling overwhelmed or powerless due to injustice and inequality. Today's speakers have each walked their own path through adversity and found ways to transform those experiences into meaningful impact for others. Our hope is that the stories will inspire you, remind you that resilience is possible, and encourage anyone who may be struggling to seek support, whether through Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, another organization, or someone they trust. After each speaker has shared their journey, we're going to bring everyone back together for a moderated Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions or comments using the chat feature through the program, and any questions you submit will be shared anonymously. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dan, a lawyer, law professor, filmmaker, a nationally recognized mental health advocate, and someone who has helped change the conversation about mental health in the legal profession. For more than 2 decades, Dan has lived with major depression while building a successful legal career. And rather than hiding that experience, he chose to share it. In doing so, he's become one of the legal profession's leading voices on mental health, hope, and resilience. Dan is the creator of the groundbreaking Lawyers with Depression website, which has provided education, support, and hope to countless lawyers around the world. And his latest website is the Buffalo Depression Project. He currently serves as the Judicial Wellness Coordinator for New York's Unified Court System, where he develops well-being initiatives for court employees and teaches mental health and well-being in the legal profession at the University of Buffalo School of Law. His advocacy has reached audiences nationwide through more than 200 presentations and has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, CNN, NPR, and many other media outlets. And most recently, Dan has shared his story in 2 powerful documentaries, My Brother Lost in Time, A Bipolar Life, and Travels with George, A Journey Through Depression, Connection, and Friendship. Finally, he just released an article, Overcoming Loneliness in the Legal Profession, published in the New York State Bar Association Journal. Next, who's going to speak is Zeno, a recent graduate from Western New England University School of Law, whose commitment to justice has already made a remarkable impact both inside and outside the legal profession. While working full-time throughout law school, Zeno built experience across public defense, innocence advocacy, civil rights enforcement, consumer protection, employment law, and complex litigation. But what truly distinguishes him is a deep commitment to using the law as a vehicle for equity, opportunity, and lasting change. Driven by that mission, he founded the Just Us movement, a nonprofit dedicated to expanding legal education, leadership development, health equity, and community empowerment. His work has already been recognized with a Business West Difference Maker Award. He received the Western New England Black Law Students Association Community Service Award and was awarded the prestigious IOLTA grant, honoring organizations that make a meaningful impact through the legal services and access to justice. And finally, Dimple is an attorney, award winning author, leadership coach, and internationally recognized speaker whose work is transforming how organizations think about burnout, moral injury, grief, and sustainable service. After nearly decades in the humanitarian sector, Dimple witnessed firsthand the toll that burnout, trauma, and the expectation of service before self can take on individuals and organizations. She transformed those experiences into a body of work that is helping organizations around the world rethink how they support the people dedicated to serving others. She's the founder of Roots and Clouds, a leadership coaching and consulting practice. She's also the author of the award winning book, Tell Me My Story, challenging the narrative of service before self. She's also the creator and host of Service Without Sacrifice podcast, and most recently launched Love in Action, an empathy centered initiative whose first collection of empathy cards, Seasons of Grief, helps people navigate loss through intentional practice of connection and care. So, welcome everybody, and I'm so happy you're here. There was a lot to get through because all three of you have done a number of wonderful things. So, we are going to start with Dan. So, I am going to highlight Dan. Here you go. And let's start. I want to start by just asking you, let's talk about your story and your background. Help us understand what you were going through and take us back to the beginning. What was happening in your life? What was the pain or adversity you were experiencing?
Sure. So when I was 40 years old, I was the managing partner at my litigation firm in Buffalo, New York. We handled cases throughout New York State. I handled them principally in New York City. And I'd always struggled with stress and anxiety, sometimes burnout, but I always bounced back fairly well. I'd go through some therapy, I'd exercise a little better, and I would bounce back. But when I was about 40, something kind of dramatically changed in my life. I didn't bounce back, and I think the three things I noticed for me, the dominant symptoms were really a persistent sense of sadness, which a lot of people would be surprised by if they knew, because I'm a very outgoing, upbeat person. The second thing was trouble with my sleeping. I'd always have trouble sleeping before a big trial or depositions or whatever, but this went on and on for weeks and months. The same was true for the sadness. And finally, where the rubber met the road as a trial lawyer and a litigator was I began to have a lot of problems concentrating, the ability to get things done, to be productive. And, that's our bread and butter as lawyers. We have to read a lot, write a lot, speak a lot. And that was all impaired by what I came to be diagnosed with. It was major depression. So at that time, a very difficult thing to go through for me on all levels of my life. I took a leave of absence from my job as a partner at the firm for 6 months. At that time, I tried to recuperate, regain my balance through therapy and medication and support. And, that was 25 years ago. So here I am 25 years later speaking to you about this topic. So I'm very humbled by it and very privileged to be with everybody today. I think that over many years, I've learned different things at different stages of my life and in my career. And I think for me, where for me, when I think about depression, major depression, is that the two pillars of it really are a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. You know, you really become disempowered. You feel that for some of it, for physical reasons, you're tired all the time, you're physically exhausted, you're not sleeping well. So you feel a sense of helplessness to get things done or to change your life. And I think what that does then leads to a sense of hopelessness, that things are just going to go on and on and on. When the major depression really took hold over me, the thing I look forward to the most of my day was going to sleep
Mm,
because at least at that time, I wasn't in pain. Depression is very much a physical and mental and emotional feeling of pain. It's really the absence of emotions, not so much sadness, though that could be a part of it. You're kind of become alienated from the world because you're in this spacesuit of depression and you're looking around and everybody seems to be going about their lives um, not in a state of depression. So it's a very isolating, lonely condition, I found. And then after 6 months, I came back to my law firm and everybody, I walked in the door and my secretary said, "Hey, good morning, Dan." Like everybody was, "Hi, how you doing?" Like nothing had ever happened. Like I'd
mm,
just been in the office the day before. And I thought, if I had a broken leg or surgery or, people would have been inquiring about that,
mhm.
but they didn't. And my partner said, "Well, you're back in the saddle. That's great." Well, I wasn't really back in the saddle. And like many people with depression, you go through acute and chronic stages, periods where it's really difficult. And then long periods where, you're not feeling great. And then long periods where you are feeling well. So I think for a lot of people, it's a lifelong issue of managing it. And I think that, in a nutshell, is where I began, and where
Yeah.
I am now.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that experience with us. And I know each of you are being vulnerable and sharing that for the audience. So I definitely appreciate it. So part of why you're here is you did, I assume, reach out for some help. Tell me a little bit about the help you received. What prompted you to get that help?
Well, to be honest, at first it was therapy, right? And over time, I'd gone on and off to therapy, but I kind of think it was culturally acceptable thing to do,
Mm,
like I'm going because I'm stressed or, anxious and but in my book, it was a very different thing to say to anybody, and I didn't say to anybody, including my wife or colleagues or friends. I'm actually going to a therapist because of major depression or depression. And I grew up in a time, my dad was a World War II vet, where there was a lot of stigma associated with any kind of mental health disorder. And then 25 years ago, in our legal culture, there was no discussion about these issues. So you didn't talk about them, right? So here I was, I really wouldn't talk about what was going on in therapy. And then therapy, unlike the previous times, gravitated into talking about these really physical, not sleeping, crying, concentrating. And the therapist said, "Listen, whatever we're doing isn't penetrating your depression, and you
mm,
need to see a psychiatrist." So I did. And I made sure I saw somebody deep in an office park, nowhere near the courts or downtown, or no one would see me. And I entered and, he put me on antidepressants. Well, I thought that was Jesus, the end of it, but it wasn't nearly as easy as that. And over time, I found one of the things that really struck me was the stigma. And, stigma, the roots of the word, going back to Latin or Greek, are wound. So when we stigmatize somebody, we wound somebody. I think that's a more accurate meaning and description for what stigma is. So for me, when I came back, for example, nobody talked about my depression, right? So the other thing is, I noticed over time people stop asking me to lunch.
mm,
People, partners, or other associates who used to come in my office all the time seeking advice on cases, that dropped, right? People looked at me different, you know, um, always kind of a worried look, I guess, but they didn't say, what they were thinking about. So I felt wounded by those things, and I guess ashamed,
mm,
and I think looking back on it, they just it's not their fault. They're not like some mean ogre people. I just don't think they had a reference point for what depression was. I think at best, most of them thought of it as sadness or burnout, go on a vacation kind of thing, but it was far, far, far from that. So at some point, as I started to recover further down the road, I decided that I don't want anybody out there who's a lawyer or law student or judge or loved one to have to go through what I went through, which was awful. Not only the disease of depression, but the loneliness and the stigma. So I created a website 20 years ago called Lawyers with Depression,
Hmm.
and it's still going today. And really through the efforts of so many people that have contributed to it, it's become a global thing. And I think that that's an indication that this is a conversation that we're all interested in having. And I think when I think about what's helped me a lot, certainly therapy, because there's a form of this. There is such a thing, and I had to learn of depressive thinking. There are certain thoughts that are really detached from reality, really, and they're very negative, ruminative thoughts where they I always say now depression's a terrible liar, because it'll tell you lies about yourself and other people. So I had to unpack that. The medication was really to address all the dramatic physical things I was going through to help me sleep better, get some more energy. For me, starting the website was very important because it gave me a sense of meaning and purpose. Is
Mm.
my way of taking back the conversation, taking ownership of the conversation. Um, and then I started a depression support group in my community 20 years ago, we just had a meeting today, we meet twice a week. And so that has been a very good thing because the good thing about it is they're all lawyers who are part of the group, and you don't have to
Hmm.
explain what lawyering is. And they all struggle with depression. So you don't have to explain what that is. So I think you can't go through it, alone. Uh, what what I'd like to say, and then I'll listen, if you have more questions, is getting back to this idea of meaning and purpose. And I think separate and apart from the issue of depression, I think, depression is an epidemic in the legal profession. And I think, why is that the case? And I think some of the factors that make that the case are unique to the legal culture. And there's all kinds of things unique to it. Not having enough time for self-care, uh, not just stress, but perpetual chronic stress, demands on one's time, not having time to do things that wouldn't make you feel well. So I think that when I think of it, I think that meaning and purpose are something we always don't think of when we think of managing depression, but I think it's a very important thing because one of the symptoms of depression is the sense of meaninglessness. And I think, the counterweight to that is a sense of purpose and meaning. So after the website, more recently, 3 years ago, my younger brother, uh, he was 3 years younger than me, he struggled with bipolar disorder his whole life. And my poor brother was a brilliant person and had long periods of success. And 3 years ago, he died suddenly. He died by suicide.
Mm.
So it was really rocked my world. I mean, we're very, very close. And so I wrote about it, and an independent filmmaker read about the story and decided to make a documentary about it. And the title is My Brother Lost in Time, A Bipolar Life. And it appeared on PBS a couple years ago for National Depression Awareness Month. And then last year we made a second film that I think also goes to the sense of meaning, but it goes to the sense of a few other things. About 10 years ago, I was going through a difficult period of depression, and in my spiritual tradition of Catholicism, I felt poor in spirit. So, not just depressed, but completely depleted. as a human being. And so a friend told me about this place called St. Luke's Mission, and it was Buffalo is one of the most segregated cities in America. So it's on the east side of Buffalo, which is poor, filled with a number of minorities. And I asked the director, how could I be of help, not knowing what I was doing, really. And she matched me and let me mentor a young child named George, who's 9 and who just happened to be Black. And we started our journey. He's 20 now. So last year, the same filmmaker came up with the idea to do a short film about George and I. It's called Travels with George, A Journey Through Depression, Connection, and Friendship. And that aired on PBS last fall. And why I mention it is because connection and friendship uh, are counterweights to that powerful sense of loneliness and stigma that we feel. And I think it's miraculous that I found such meaning and connection in a 9-year-old child. I mean, George and I talk about it all the time. What are the chances of that, George? It's like 1 in a million.
Hmm.
And so the film Travels with George is about our journey together. And I think it turns a lot of assumptions on their head. A lot of times when people would see us out together, they think, oh, how wonderful, George, you're helping George, and he has mental illness because people kind of knew about my work. And say, no, I'm the one with mental illness, and George is helping me. And or they'll say, how wonderful what you do for George. And it just seems like it's hard to express how much George does for me. So we really love one another. And at the premiere of the film, it was held at the University of Buffalo School for the Arts. We had like 300 people, and George came in a tuxedo. He chose that tuxedo, and everybody wanted to meet George, and he just lit up the room. And after the film was played, there was a panel discussion, and I began. I didn't really have words to say much. I mean, I didn't even know. So I said, listen, very simply, George and his mother, who's a fantastic human being like George, I asked them to stand up, and they got a standing ovation. And then I said, the truth is, in the simplest of terms, what I found, I think, besides connection, and friendship, what I found in that place was a sense of goodness. And I think oftentimes in our world that's so toxic and divisive, in our profession, which can be toxic and divisive, um, lots of times, or it could be, lawyers are involved in trying to help people who are in big trouble or wounded themselves. And, we're traumatized ourselves as lawyers. Or so I think to me, it's very important for lawyers and for all of us as humans to reconnect or really be very aware of where we're getting our sense of goodness from. And I think that's something to me that speaks more than just about meaning or purpose. I think it has a spiritual dimension, whatever your faith or non-faith is. But I think everybody can understand, that what it's like to be in the presence of good people, right? And how healing that is, and good for us it is.
So, first of all, thank you so much. You hit upon such an important piece of the stigma, and that not only just going back to some things you talked about, which I think are so important, the stigma of talking about this. And by doing this program, you're fighting the stigma. You came out and you did, again, those documentaries and the websites. You also did, you have another website, the Buffalo Project.
Yeah, so
Do you
after
want to talk
the
a little bit
yeah,
about that?
yeah, after the death of my brother, I've done so much stuff around the country on this topic. And after we made the film, I really had a sense that our community of Western New York, which is about 1 million people, had failed my brother. The mental health care system had failed my brother. And it really devastated me. You know, like nothing else I'd ever experienced. So I decided in memory of my brother, I think our community and I think communities across the country can replicate the model by having a website and, where it's like a virtual home where people in the community can come and learn about this specific topic. Because lots of times over the years, I've met hundreds of people like, I don't know where to go. I mean, I don't know. I mean, is there anybody like me? And we have wonderful, wonderful, talented mental health organizations that I work with routinely. I know all the executive directors, and I've said to them, the tragedy is people don't know what the hell you do. They have no idea what you do. So I said, one of the thoughts I had in making the website, it's free, is to when people, you know, are searching for help or support, they could just search local Buffalo depression or help, and it will, I mean, that the dream is that it would take them there. And the other thing is that in seeking support, so we have a wonderful organization in Buffalo called Compeer, which matches people with mental illness with peers. So that they're actually in the film Travels with George. So I said to the director, who's a friend of mine, you're such wonderful people, and but no one knows what you do. So I said, why don't we make a 3-minute video with the filmmaker from the movie? 3 minutes, rather than a hyperlink on my website where you say, okay, here's the website and phone number. Tell us what you do. Like
Hmm.
if I have depression or my adult son or my child and I come to you, what would happen? And this we're going to expand it to other mental health care places and treating psychiatrists or psychologists. If you're Dr. John Smith, it's hit or miss. I don't know who you are. I mean, what would you do if you saw me and I have depression? So I'm not trying to save the world or anything, and it's really meant as a tribute to my brother. So that's what motivates me. And yeah, so.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. I really, again, I appreciate everything you've shared. I'm hoping that maybe you could put your website in the chat so people can see that and write that down so they can visit both of those websites. But thank you again. You've done, as I said, remarkable things again with your documentaries and your websites and the group that you started. So thank you so much for sharing. And I want to now talk to Zeno and hear a little bit more from you. And once again, I am just going to, let's see, put this. Give me 1 second. I want to make sure that, well, why don't we start while I'm looking for my little button so I can highlight you. But let's start with going back to the beginning and talking about your challenges and what brought
Yeah,
you ultimately here.
absolutely. First of all, Amy, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Daniel, Dimple, you both are extremely amazing in the work that you've done in the past and the things that you're doing now. So thank you so much for allowing me to take the stage and then be here in this platform. Um, it's kind of weird, right? I'm just graduating from law school. And everyone, please bear with me. I'm preparing for the bar, so my mind might be a little scatterbrained and I might be all over the place, but we'll get through it. So it's weird because I'm thinking about, my journey to this stage, and my mind always goes back to that saying, like everything makes sense in reverse. Um, but I feel like I'm just at the beginning, right? This is just a start. I haven't gotten barred yet. I just graduated law school, so I'm going into that next stage of becoming a lawyer and one day becoming an attorney, hopefully very soon. But when I look back from the beginning, I'm originally from Philadelphia, great family, great background, a lot of amazing people in my life, and a lot of great mentors, a lot of great people along the way that I was raised with and came up with and was taught by and seeing amazing people do great things. And I think with that, um, I was raised by the system that I'm working in. I was raised by the the people that I support now. And I think that's so empowering to me because I'm just all around inspired by the work. So it means nothing to me to wake up every day and go to work. And that's what I've always like wanted to do. That's what my dad has always like instilled in me of like you never want to work a day in your life, right? You always want to know that you're going to do something that you love and that you're doing. And I think this work and this line and the things that I'm doing currently is providing that platform for me. So when I say that I was, before the age of I want to say 10. I went to 3 funerals of people that were involved in drug and opioid abuse and overdoses and gun violence and domestic violence and things like that. And those people being extremely close to me, family members, family friends, things like that. It really shaped me into the work that I'm doing today. I've had the opportunity to work in a lot of different sectors of the law and kind of be able to gain that experience along the way because I put myself out there and I wanted to do it. And I wanted to learn the ins and outs of those areas of law because it directly impacted my life. And we'll go into it a little bit later with the Just Us movement, but a lot of the programming that we put on has a direct impact to not only the loved ones in my life, but the loved ones in my board members' lives and the things that, touch people on a day-to-day basis in real life. And that was really important to me to kind of instill from the beginning because people go through unspoken battles all day, every day. So it was just extremely important to me that I pay homage to the people that came before me, the ones that raised me, the ones that went through those struggles so that now I can kind of do that work.
Can you talk? Thank you, by the way. And I am wondering if you could share when was that moment that made you say, I want to go to law school. I want to do something about it. Can you talk a little bit about what was going on at that time?
Absolutely. I was young. I was actually, when I was younger, I wanted to be an architect. And I was going through like middle school and elementary school, like, drawing and building things and things like that. And then Trayvon Martin's murder happened, and I was I was really taken aback because my family and the people around me, um, were glued to the TV. They were glued to the news, hearing about, different stories and people talking about the different, elements of a case and talking about their opinions on policy and stand your ground laws and things like that. And all throughout all of that
Mm.
on the TV and like me sitting in the next room watching and listening, you see Esquire at the end of everyone's names. And I'm like, what is that? Why is that important? Like, why are we listening to these people talk? Like, why are they so important? And it just became like kind of apparent to me of how much power and not only just power, but discernment that attorneys have and lawyers have, and the good that you can do with that title, right? The good that you can do with that Esquire. And so from there, I wasn't really fully into social justice and socioeconomics and all of that just quite yet, but it kind of opened my mindset to the things that a lawyer can do. And I didn't really get to meet a lawyer until later on in high school and things like that. And then into undergrad, I started kind of piecing it all together of like, oh, this is how that
Mm.
works. That's how that works through like my social justice classes and my criminal justice classes and my political science classes. And then finally, once I graduated from undergrad, unfortunately, COVID hit, 2020 hit, and
Mm.
it was the year of social justice, right? There were marches happening around the nation. There was women's marches, George Floyd's march, and I took part in pretty much everything. And I was there. I was in the mix of it. I was in Philadelphia at the time, and me and my friends would go out and go and see everything that's happening and be involved and kind of be on the ground because a lot of my work has been on the ground up to that point and up to this point as well. Um, so I think the importance with that was I'm seeing the pain, I'm seeing the people on the streets crying, I'm hearing the chants, I'm hearing the it's crazy. Like I'm there in the moment and then I go home later and then I see where I was just at on the news. Like there's thousands of demonstrators like in front of City Hall and just seeing the movement and power behind all of that kind of
Mhm.
opened my mind to the stories from when I was a kid that I didn't really piece together until now.
Hmm.
And those conversations that I've had with my mom and my dad and my grandparents throughout the years, talking about our family and some of the struggles that we've gone through, and then kind of like piecing together, oh, like that's why so and so is acting this way, or their lives turned out that way, or they're no longer with us, or why we had to do that or live there and do. And so it just all kind of came together, and I realized that I lived. I lived the work that I'm doing, and I've lived the things that I strive to do, and I've lived the things that people are marching in the streets for, and I've lived the things that we see in the textbooks, and we've been fighting years and decades and hundreds of years to get to this point too. And that was just all around inspiring, and kind of light bulb went off of like, all right, maybe I should take this a little bit more serious and kind of
Mm.
figure out ways that I can help my community, help my society, help the community at large, and not even just an isolated sector. So that's where kind of my drive and passion towards the work that I'm working towards came from.
It's an amazing story that you shared, and you certainly have helped people. And I want this to be an opportunity for you to talk about the nonprofit that you started, the Just Us movement. But I also want to point out to the viewers, he started this while in law school. So as if law school isn't stressful enough, um, he again started this organization. So let's hear about, tell us a little bit more about it.
Thank you. Thank you. So one of my first full-time roles, I was a community outreach coordinator in the district attorney's office in Massachusetts, Hampden County. And throughout that role, I had a lot of opportunities just being with the community, going to CACA conferences, learning about social, like uh, learning about all of the things that we talked about earlier, right? And then also learning about new things that I've never heard about before. And then going into the community, learning about things that I didn't know was really all that prevalent until, you actually hear from community members, you hear from students, you hear from parents. So all of those kind of lessons and opportunities that I had in that, I took it, I learned from it, and I took it into my first year of law school. And then in my first year of law school, I was looking around at all of these organizations and student organizations and just trying to implement that and take pieces from that and put it into there so that we can, just like grow the ecosystem of service, right? And grow that ecosystem of things that we can do and get students involved and open their eyes to the things that I was learning all throughout my full-time job at that point because I'm an evening student. Um, so it was kind of just me spreading awareness as I flowed through law school and as I took on different leadership roles. And so as I moved throughout law school, I kind of felt like I needed more training in being an attorney, being a lawyer. So I had to move into more of a legal-esque role. So I took a paralegal role, and then that took me out of the community service role, and it kind of left a hole, right? I was really sitting there like, I don't really have time to, leave my desk and go and, do Big Brothers Big Sisters today, or do this or do that as I used to be able to when I was in that community service role. So within that, I was kind of just sitting back, like figuring out what I can really do to, what more can I do? Because at this point, I was a part of student organizations, but I just felt there was a bigger purpose and there was bigger things that I could do, and I had that time in the evenings to spare and spend. Um, so the Just Us movement was kind of like there, right? It was something that happened by not just my um not just my experiences, but the people around me's experiences, my family, my friends, my colleagues, my board members, the closest people to me. Their experiences kind of shaped how we were able to build, and we wanted to build that off of education, law, and health. So like I said, I was raised, by the systems that we, take a part of in everyday life. And what I mean by that in health, I was in elementary school attending, AA meetings with family members, drinking coffee and eating cookies in the back, like, listening in on the meetings. I was a part of that, but wasn't aware of what that meant until I went to a CACA conference and heard about stigma and learned about stigma. and learned about all the ways that depression can lead to opioid use or drug dependency, and how and what that actually meant, and the socioeconomics behind depression and mental health disorder, and why that connection is so tight. And it makes sense in the grand scheme of things, but I don't think people take the time out of their busy day-to-day lives to kind of take a step back and say, oh, like this is why everything operates the way it does. And so within that, I think in my first, taking a little step back here, in my first torts class in law school, I was like, oh, everything's connected. Everything's interconnected.
Mm,
My mind is blown. It's completely blown. I wasn't aware that everything is so connected in the way it is, but it is. And so I said health and then education. And I looked at my education, kind of looked back into the opportunities that I did have, opportunities that I didn't have, and then the opportunities that my little at the time had in front of them, and how different, and I'm still with my little now, and how different his experience is to mine, and some of the things that he doesn't know that I wish that I knew at his age and that I can give to him. And that was just so important to me and so enlightening to me, and also the other kids that I had under my wing at the time. And then with law, I think it was just super, that was the goal. It makes sense. And like I said, with torts, it fits into everything. So I think with the under that umbrella of those three kind of pillars, we're able to touch so many different communities, so many different needs, so many different um just people overall. And I think the biggest thing with our organization right now, and the one thing I really want to build off of, we do not care about the numbers. We want to have the impact. We want to have the
mm.
visual. And so some of the webinars that we host and some of the bi-monthly webinars that we do are real world topics. They range from opioid use. We do Narcan trainings. Um, we've had mental health webinars. We've had LCL come in and talk about there's professional well-being and mental health. We've had people come in and talk about domestic abuse situations. We've had people come in and talk about the court system and just the general lay of the land and law of the land. And I think it's just so important that these topics and ideas get out there in a simplistic way, so that the lay person can say, oh, like that makes sense. Like I know that I lived that already, right? Because we all live it. It's just like when it's put in your face in a way that is digestible, then you can eat it, right? You can take it all in and then you can share it with others. And that was the whole idea behind the Just Us movement. We're an access to justice organization. We're a social justice organization, and we want those in our communities, which is the entire nation, which is the entire world, really, to be able to have access to information, access to knowledge. Um, because one thing that anyone can't take away from you is what's up here.
Absolutely. And by the way, I also want to add that the title, very clever, the name of the organization, very clever.
Thank you.
Do you want to share quickly the website address? And then also later on, we'll have you put that in the chat. And I believe that people can volunteer with you.
Yes, so it's justusmovement.net, and we have all of our social medias is the Just Us Movement on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We share a whole bunch of resources. We're starting to do a lot of different things in terms of and the one thing I didn't mention is our food drives, where my mom's a caterer, so she comes out and she
Oh,
makes hot meals for people in soup kitchens. We've gone to churches, we've gone to shelters, and we make actual hot meals for people to enjoy around Christmas time, whenever the need is there. And with volunteering, you can please come out and do that. Sometimes we'll put up the dates that we have for the future. Please attend our webinars. We have amazing speakers from across all professions coming out to just give that reliable information. And I'll definitely share the links and everything in the chat. We just have
excellent.
some amazing people that come out and support and really spread some amazing information.
The organization is really wonderful. I mean, again, providing food, providing those webinars, really, really wonderful. And I just want to add that when people volunteer, it is actually shown that it is good for your mental health to give to other people. So if that encourages anyone to volunteer with the Just Us movement, I think that Zena would appreciate that. So
Absolutely.
thank you again for sharing your story, again, sharing what a wonderful organization was born out of your experience, the adversity. So next, I want to hand it over to Dimple. Dimple, it's been a while, and thank you for listening to, again, these wonderful stories. And you have an amazing story to share as well. So I'm going to hand it off to you. And if you can share with us from the beginning, what was going on? What was the adversity? What was the pain?
Thanks. Thanks for having me back. And yeah, thank you, Zeno and Dan, for sharing your stories. Um, I feel like there's no like single piece of adversity. I feel like there's so
Mm,
many. But the story that I often share, which I think is kind of the impetus for the work that I do, is that I I started my career out at the Attorney General's office in Denver, and I uh, was part of a unit that worked on child abuse and neglect cases. And I was very fortunate because I had a boss who understood the impact of that work on us. And so he required that we attend an annual vicarious trauma training. Um, and I was a brand new attorney and a little cocky and thinking that I didn't really need this training because
mm,
I was good. I could do this work no problem. Um, but the good thing about being required to go attend something like that was that it planted a seed. And
mm,
so after I left the Attorney General's office, I ended up moving into the federal government, and I spent the next 18 years working on asylum and refugee policy and operations for the US government. And in that role, about 12 of those years were spent in the field in both in like staff and leadership roles, where I spent a good chunk of my time sitting face to face with refugee and asylum seeker or asylum applicants who were seeking to resettle in the US. And so, really sitting with them in their trauma day in, day out, listening to their stories, adjudicating their cases, and for the and I always took a lot of pride in being able to put up what I called a wall of professionalism. So I felt like it wasn't that I didn't have empathy, but it was what I had to do in order to be able to keep showing up to do the work. And about 6 years into the job, I was in Zambia on assignment, and kind of what Dan described in some ways, where I was really having trouble sleeping. If I did sleep, I was having really horrific nightmares where I was reliving what I had heard during the day. And those cases in particular were really some of the most brutal cases I had ever adjudicated. And so it was really painful. And it was also the first time that I really couldn't regulate my emotions in the
mm,
interviews. And so I would find myself crying with the applicants. And so it was really and I really felt like there was something wrong with me because again, I think when we get into these spaces, it can feel very isolating, and we start to look around to the people around us, and because we haven't really normalized these conversations, and even though Dan was talking about all those years ago, and even for me it was all those years ago, there's still a stigma associated when we talk about mental health, right? And so it was just really, I felt like everyone else was fine. Maybe I couldn't handle this work. And it wasn't until I got home from that trip that I remembered the training that I had done 10 years before that,
mm,
and started looking into it and realized very quickly that vicarious trauma was a very real impact of doing this kind of humanitarian work and really honestly, it was more just trauma exposed work, right? And so for me, so part of doing this work was we had very specialized training to be able to interview people in a non-adversarial way. And out of all these 6 weeks of like training that we had, they did half a day of interviewing survivors of torture. And of that, there was maybe a 30-minute after hours session about, hey, you should probably take care of yourself. But like the words vicarious trauma were never used. There was nothing. And
Mm,
so part of it, what for me was I just felt like I had this moment of feeling like I cannot be the only person experiencing this in my workforce. And so when I returned from overseas, at the time I was posted overseas, and when I rotated back, I asked, I said, look, I really think that this is something that we're not talking about and we should be talking about. And I'd really like to help do that. And so I was very fortunate that I had people around me that were open to letting me kind of jump into this. And so I started creating programs and things where we were actually talking about, like, let's talk about what really happens when we're out in the field and when we are 24/7, together, and then also doing this work and just the realities. And so we started building that into the work that we were doing. But I just want to add one other thing real quick, which is that then the 2016 elections happened, and there was a whole like shift for me in terms of it wasn't just vicarious trauma that I was really experiencing. Like I couldn't put a finger on it. And Dan mentioned spiritual depletion. And so that was like a big thing for me too. And as I started really looking into it, what I realized is what my experience was really about moral injury. And so then when COVID hit, I started doing some trainings around moral injury as well. And all the attorneys, I did an entire training for all the attorneys in my agency. And the number of people who wrote to me and said, oh, I now have a word to describe
mm,
what it is I have been experiencing. And I think like the language we use is so important. And resilience, I really don't like the word resilience because I think it's been overused. And also, what I found during COVID was that my agency in particular would constantly put out this messaging talking about how resilient our workforce is and look at all
mm,
these things we're doing. Meanwhile, I was like holding these sessions for people who are like, I don't feel resilient. Like maybe there's something
yeah.
wrong with me. And so, again, like I think a lot of times in this arena of mental health and this idea of resilience, we end up putting a lot of the burden on the individual instead of looking at the systemic issues that underlie this that are resulting in this. And that's like the thing that we really need to be addressing. And so that's really kind of what and then ultimately that led me to leave my job. And I was very privileged in the position I had to be able to do that. But I couldn't work for the administration anymore. And I left, and I ended up writing a book that talked about this experience and this need that we have to create a duty of care that centers our humanity instead of just productivity and profit and everything else. So
It's amazing. I mean, again, you experienced the vicarious trauma, the moral injury, and you recognized, hey, it's not just me, although maybe initially you thought that. And you took this and you said, I have to do more for the community. And that's when you started doing your own trainings and things like that, which is, again, amazing. And then you wrote your book. Tell us a little bit more about Roots in the Cloud and what that is about. And then I also want to get to your latest venture, which is Love in Action and your grief cards. And I know grief is something that you're very focused on right now because of your personal experience and also understand the collective grief. So I'm going to back up. Let's talk about the Roots in the Cloud first.
yeah, so Roots in the Clouds is just kind of my umbrella organization. Um, it's funny because I have really found myself at a pivot point, even in doing this work lately. And I find that, I think that what best describes what I do is writing and speaking more than anything. And I just am really on this mission to kind of restore the language of connection, because I think that at the end of the day, um, you know, reclaiming our humanity and making service sustainable, this was never meant to be an individual burden. It was always a shared responsibility.
Mm,
And so, I think that part of what I'm trying to do through Roots in the Clouds is really, again, put the human right back in the center of it. So, you know, I really work with or support a lot of mission-driven organizations and social justice organizations, and they all have these incredible mission statements, and they're doing incredible work to serve, you know, these segments of humanity that really need our help. And they are often the worst offenders when it comes to taking care of their own people. And so, you know, one of the things that I always talk about is this idea that we were never meant to kind of navigate the complexity of being human alone. And I think what I always look at, like, the Industrial Revolution as being the turning point where, you know, until then, we really were still so connected to our bodies. We listened, you know, we looked at when the sun came up and when it went down, and, you know, and we moved with the rhythms of nature. And instead, when industrialization came in, suddenly we wanted consistency, and we wanted, you know, like there were set times to eat, set times for breaks, you know, and things that don't necessarily work with each of us. And so, and I get it because we work in these bigger organizations and whatnot, but as a result, we were kind of disconnected from ourselves, from each other. And that's kind of where, like, through Roots in the Clouds is what I'm really trying to help individuals and organizations get back to.
And yeah, so tell us also about your latest adventure or venture. Again, you sent me some beautiful cards on grief. And so I think everybody would be interested in hearing a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So again, I think a lot of what we talk about, like we hear the word burnout a lot. And a lot of times burnout is used as this umbrella term to just like capture, you know, oh, everyone's burned out, but everyone is not burned out. There's an element of burnout for sure. But again, I think people are really experiencing moral injury that's coming out of institutional betrayal. But the other piece of it is, I think we are experiencing grief in ways that we have never experienced in our lifetimes. And so, you know, grief can be individual in terms of, like, you know, we lose a loved one, or you know, we lose a job, or whatever it is. But I think in this moment, especially like post COVID, there is this element of collective grief that rarely gets addressed. And again, we don't talk about it as grief. We talk about it as all these other things. And grief is something that, again, our ancestors knew was never something that we were supposed to go through alone. We were always supposed to be in community. We were supposed to mark it with ritual. We were supposed to acknowledge it. And so I think that in this moment of time where people feel isolated and they feel lonely and disconnected, there's a lot of grief in that. And so I created a new project called Love in Action, and they're empathy cards. And so the first collection is for seasons of grief and loss. And so for me, this came out of another adversity, which was losing my mom in 2019. And it was very unexpected. And when she passed away, you know, we were very close, and she had lived here with me. And suddenly, you know, the day after the funeral, like, everyone was gone. And I had never felt more. And there's I think, a loneliness that comes with grief that's different than other kinds of loneliness. And then I think, you know, often we feel like we have to make other people comfortable. So when people ask us, you know, like,
Yes.
or if they ask us at all, if they acknowledge it at all, we feel this need to be like, oh no, I'm okay, you know, or I'm fine, or whatever. And we wear these masks that that we kind of hide behind. And so about a month after she passed away, I got this envelope in the mail, and it was filled with a bunch of cards and letters and just these notes of love and encouragement from a group of friends. And then the following month, I got another one. And this went on like this for 6 months. And it was so incredibly meaningful to know that there was a group of people out there that, number one, remembered her, that she had been here just, you know, months before, but also recognized, again, that I was grieving and that my grief was not just going away. And they weren't trying to fix it, they weren't trying to change it, but they were really meeting me where I was in this moment. And it just really meant a lot. So, what I ended up creating is, and so the idea is one box for one person. And so, there's 6 cards in the box, and each card has a little reflection on different aspects of grief that we experience, because I think oftentimes we're in these liminal spaces between two things when we're grieving. And so each one kind of talks about these different liminal spaces. And the idea is that you just have this ongoing connection with someone as they are moving through this season of grief, so they don't have to go through it alone.
Yeah, yeah, it's wonderful. And it also sounds like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it maintains your connection to them as well. So it's on both sides, which I think
Yes,
again
for
is,
sure.
as you've talked about, the collective grieving. And would you say doing these things have also continued to help heal you? Do you think you're still in that process of healing?
I mean, I think healing is a lifelong journey,
Yeah.
honestly. And, much like Dan, I also, for me, I grew up with mental health issues in my family. My dad was also bipolar. And it was really, really challenging. That was a big part of what I wrote about in my book, because everything that I work on really connects to our stories, the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories we inherit. Because I think that shifting those stories sometimes can help us, but the way that, like, the things that shape our stories and how we show up in the world and the lens through which we see and experience the world, I think really starts in childhood. And so I started writing my book and I thought, yeah, this is just going to be like a leadership book or whatever. And I
Mm,
realized really quickly that I couldn't tell this story without starting there. And it was through that I really realized, like, how much my dad went through. And how hard it must have been for him, because that was even earlier than when I was going through what I was at work. Um and so I think, like, there's so many things that happen in our lives that shape those things, and we are constantly in this process of, like, acknowledging a story, understanding the impact that it's had, and then trying to rewrite it into something that works better. And so, I just want to say, for anyone who's listening who maybe is not feeling resilient, I just want you to
mm,
know there's actually a very small percentage of the population in the world that is truly resilient. And resilience
mhm.
is about bouncing back to, this state where you were in before whatever adversity happened. Most of us, and I think most of us who are here speaking right now, that have found a way to turn pain into purpose, it's because we've experienced something called post-traumatic growth. And I think
Mm,
that's what most people go through. And so if you're out there feeling like, I don't feel resilient at all, that's okay. I think that if you are in the midst of adversity, if you're in the midst of mental health issues, or just, whether it's moral injury, whether it's depression, whether it's whatever, just know that we can often find meaning and purpose through that experience. And I don't mean to say that in a spiritual bypassing way or in a toxic positivity way, but in that there are lessons and things that we can pull out of there. And coming back to this idea of service, because that's what I hear from Zeno and from Dan and
mm.
from myself, which is all three of us went through these things and we thought, how do I create something that is going to help the greater good? And I think there is something really beautiful about service. And most people who go into law, um, you know, have this intention of serving. And then I think, again, we feel that institutional betrayal, we feel the systemic issues that come on, and then we start to get jaded and frustrated and tired. Um, and so it's just, we have to think about, like, okay, what needs to shift so I can keep serving.
Yeah, yeah. No, amazing. And I love and I'd never heard of it, the post-traumatic growth. That's, I think, a very impactful statement. And I think, again, to point out that not everybody is resilient. And I think from my takeaway here is I don't think anybody's expecting people to go out and create podcasts and do all these things, but ultimately it's reaching out for the help. So if anything is taken away from this program is just reach out for help, right? We talked a little bit about stigma, and it's not easy, but I think ultimately these stories are remarkable. But again, first thing is just reach out for help, right? That's a part of it. And I do see we have, oh, by the way, I did want to ask, do you want to share anything about your podcasts? I know that you did two separate ones.
Yeah, so I have Service Without Sacrifice, which was a limited series podcast that was in the lead up to the launch of my book. So each episode focuses on one section of the book, but there are really some very amazing conversations with leaders from all these different sectors. So if people, I would really recommend checking that out. And then the other one is What Would Ted Lasso Do?
Oh, I
If
love
you
it.
haven't seen the show Ted Lasso, it's one of my all-time favorites. And I just really found that it was an interesting way to explore life and leadership through the different episodes of the show. So a friend of mine, I pulled him in and we just kind of talked through each episode. But yeah, so those are the two.
I love it. And as just so people know, there's a third season of Ted Lasso coming out. So
Fourth.
fourth season. Okay. So it is coming out, I think, in the next day or so. So thank you again, Dimple, for sharing the things that you've done, and again for being vulnerable and sharing what you went through. How can people get in touch with you? What is your website? And we'll put it in the chat as well, but just so people can.
Yeah, so my website is roots, so that's plural, rootsintheclouds.com. And the empathy cards are on that site as well.
Okay, great, great. So we're going to come back together again. Thank you to the three of you for sharing, and again, the amazing things that you've done. I want to make sure that everybody does get the link to your websites and your organizations. So we do have some questions. We have some comments. So let's see. People are asking for the different organizations, so I'll make sure that those go in there. So somebody writes, great candid discussion about the multiple difficulties lawyers face on many fronts. Dimple's point that it is okay for lawyers to accept trauma as collateral damage in our work is plainly wrong. Has a lawyer that handles murder trials, trauma sticks with you for a long time. We need all of you and LCL to keep up all the good work you do. So thank you for that comment. Dimple, I don't know if you have a comment in response.
I mean, I'm curious to just know what you mean by accept trauma as collateral damage is wrong. I'm not sure I understand what that means or like the context.
So we might have to wait just for a moment. And
Yeah.
also, I am going to post the website into the chat. I know that all of you were kind enough to do that. Unfortunately, I don't know if that came through. So we have the Just Us movement. I put in Roots in the Cloud. And I'm going to, again, put in the Just Us movement. And I put in earlier Dan's two websites. Okay. So I'm just looking to see if there are any other questions that the audience might have, or if there is any advice that any of you have for the group to work on overcoming the adversity and reaching out for that help.
Okay, hold on. So you said that it is okay for lawyers to themselves handle the trauma we deal with seeing clients exposed to violence or abuse. Yeah, I wasn't trying to say that we shouldn't be addressing our own trauma. If that's what came across, that's not what I meant. But I do think that there are a lot of other systemic issues that are contributing to the trauma that we're experiencing. And so, yes, I agree that if you are doing murder trials or like when I was doing asylum and refugee work, My point is that in our organizations, we should have things built in to support our staff because we are in these trauma exposed professions. And so that's what I mean by it should be a partnership. Um, it shouldn't be just that we are doing that on our own. Oh,
And
okay.
yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
I guess maybe I'm just misunderstanding your question, John. So thank you.
So that person wrote, I thought it was a great point you made about what we face as lawyers. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, my sense of it, or what I've learned over time, and this is my own point of view, is that we have to do sometimes a deep dive into why we're doing what we're doing. Why do we become lawyers? Why do we go into a certain practice area of the law? And I think that personally, I believe that there's a big connection between those questions, which are unique to each of us, and why we have an epidemic of depression, anxiety, burnout, and drinking problems. For myself, who grew up in a traumatic home with a violent, abusive, alcoholic dad, for me, of all the professions I could have chosen in practice areas, what do I choose? Trial work, which is ridden with conflict, ridden with temper, ridden with, and in my role, unconsciously growing up, I was the peacekeeper. I was the pleaser. I was the one who made everybody happy, and I think, there are good, legitimate answers why we go into the law, but I think there's very much, in my own experience unconscious reasons why we go into the law. And I think, you know, that is something worthy of exploring, and I think sometimes many people, I think, go into the law not because it's their dream. It's their father's dream or their mother's dream or their grandparents. For me, it was my mother's dream that I become a lawyer. So it doesn't mean that I didn't have a wonderful profession, and I don't regret being a lawyer. But I think sometimes there's a disconnect in our lives as lawyers from who we deeply are, at our base. So that's my point.
Yeah. And thank you, Dan, for that. And as people were talking, and I know that Dimple made a point of talking about grief, but I think everybody's story here, right? There's that tie to grief. Um, and grief takes on many forms, right? It's not just somebody passing away. So that was something that struck me. I don't know if anybody in the audience has any thought on that or anybody has a comment on that.
I'd like to say one quick thing about grief,
Sure.
which is explored in my film about my brother and I. But the other day, I got a phone call from a lawyer. I was in New York City, had a matrimonial matter, and did his best to represent a client. And it was a custody dispute, and the judge made a ruling adverse to his client, who had significant mental health issues, and the client got the ruling and died by suicide.
Mm,
So that lawyer was saying to me, Dan, when I think about it, is it trauma? Is it vicarious trauma? Is it secondary trauma? I agree with Dimple. We talk about these concepts, these broad concepts. We need those words. But really, I think, in naming what it really is, which is grief. And, we don't think of lawyers as experiencing grief. But I think that, all these polls and all these studies and all these surveys, we've polled all kinds of things. Certainly, I don't think we've polled grief and how much that is we call it other things,
mm,
but I think that is a unique form of trauma. At least as I've experienced it talking to other people, and in my own life with the loss of my brother, um, they can be interconnected but different. I went through profound grief at the loss of my brother, which helped fuel some depression. But in many ways, it was different. There was a loss that I could identify that was an experience outside myself as opposed to depression, which so often is an internal. You don't have to have a trigger or an event, to experience depression. So I think it always helps me to identify, what is the experience and giving it some kind of label. It's
Mhm.
a provisional label, but I think it's helpful in distinguishing, am I sad or am I depressed? They're two different things. Or I talk to lawyers, am I bored or depressed? They could be similar
Mm,
things. So,
right.
like unpacking those ideas, I think Dimple made a great point about moral injury. That is a certain kind of trauma that's different than other kind of
Hmm.
trauma, you know?
So I also wanted to mention related to grief, Dr. Tracy Myers did a webinar, um, I think maybe a couple of years ago, but if you go to our digital library on our website, and you type in grief, I'm sure her webinar will show up there if people want to listen to that. And it was grief also around the holidays, which can be a time that I think triggers, I think any time, but that is a particular time of the year. So I'm just wondering if we have any other questions or,
Can
yes,
I
Dimple, please.
can I answer this one about
Oh, sure.
from Mia? It says, you all have talked about how advocacy and well-being work can be emotionally demanding. What helps you remain resilient and committed when the systems you're working to change seem resistant? So it's a great question. And I loved what Dan was talking about earlier about like helpless and hopeless. I think it's really easy, especially in the world we're living in right now. Um, I've been writing about this, like we're in this era of polycrisis. So we've got these multiple overlapping crises all at one time, and there's a lot going on. But one of the things that I often talk about is this practice of collective imagination. And so this is our capacity to hold pain and possibility together. And I spend, and in terms of like how do you actually do that? I think it's about being intentional about noticing, yes, like this is really painful, this is really frustrating, naming all those kinds of emotions, and then also being able to say, and I really believe that we can get to something better, and thinking about how we do that. And this is where I think community comes in a lot. And
Mhm.
one of the things about my book that I wish I could go back and change, and I think every author would always have something they want to go back and change, but I talk a lot about self-care in my book, but I really have shifted in the last few years that I think we need collective care. And
Mhm.
so, the more that we can do in community, and then also, like, I spend a lot of time writing, because writing, even if you're journaling or actually writing essays to put out, these things help us process our emotions. And then having a spiritual practice. And so this does not have to mean a religious practice, but a spiritual practice, meaning something that replenishes your spirit. So I do have like a daily meditation practice that helps me a lot to stay grounded. But for me, the other big thing is I get out into nature a lot. And so all of my work is rooted in spiritual ecology, because I really think that nature teaches us about resilience, and it teaches us how to, this idea that when a tree is wounded, it doesn't heal by itself. It relies on
Mm.
everything around it to help it stand up. And so getting out in nature and just looking up helps to give you perspective, because we remember how small we are in the grand scheme of everything. And so as much time as you can do things like that. That is something that has really helped me personally.
And I'll just emphasize getting out in nature. There are studies that prove that it is beneficial to one's mental health. So I just wanted to respond to that. Dan, yes, please.
Yeah, there's a question about the recent story I told about the a lawyer who lost their client, died by suicide because of a ruling from the judge. So I am the New York State Judicial Wellness Coordinator for the Office of Court Administration. So I'm responsible for planning policy for our 1,600 state Supreme Court judges. So in that particular case, I'll just give the general details. The judge also contacted me and was devastated by this, and hadn't slept in weeks, couldn't sleep, was traumatized by what happened in terms of the client dying by suicide. So beyond those black robes are human beings too,
Mm.
and they struggle. And we don't talk about this a lot, but over the last 7 years I've been in this role, I've heard hundreds of stories from judges who are always trying. It's a mighty battle trying to do the right thing, and lots of times they can't control all the consequences that come from it. Lots of times litigants who get these decisions, they never know what happens to them. They leave the courtroom, or something like dramatic like this happens. So I think that when we think of giving grace to other people, and we certainly many of the people who are today are lawyers or law professors, maybe even law students, but let's not forget judges, because that is not an easy job. It's not, and they struggle just like all of us, in these issues.
And I'd like to add to that. I think that's beautifully said. And like, I think part of the problem we face again is that there is this idea that these are issues that are meant to be dealt privately on your own instead of to what Cam put in here about training, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I think about this idea of a duty of care, like when we think about the duty of care that we owe to people in these sectors, it includes ensuring their well-being. And when we talk about well-being, it's a holistic well-being. So physical health, sure, physical health and safety, yes, but mental, emotional, spiritual, relational, like all of these things are what allow us to flourish as human beings. And when these things are not addressed, or we're expected to compartmentalize, which is not realistic. As much as we think that we are out there compartmentalizing, we are not. It is coming out in other ways.
Bill's over.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, this is why I'm such an advocate for this idea that we need to be bringing these issues up more, so that it it moves away from this idea that it's an individual thing, and also that it's something to be ashamed of. It's not. It is. We are human beings. We were never meant to experience this much trauma and take in all these things that we are doing. And so these are human reactions that we're having. And again, what Dan was speaking to earlier, the things that have happened in our lives, and this is what I talk about in the book too, is that these these individual life experiences that we've had in our childhood or in other parts of our life continue to impact the lens through which we see and experience the world. And
Mm-hmm.
so everyone is coming at it with these different perspectives and all these things. And so I think, yeah, the more that we can advocate and keep having conversations like this. And so the work that you all are doing, Amy, is so important, because you're helping to bring this up and into the world, into the sector where it needs to be.
Yeah, Dimple, I just want to piggyback on what you said, because we talked about the issue of training, okay, and
Mm.
teaching. And I think, like, I guess I'm prone to this, but I guess, I always think about the complexity involved in it for a couple of reasons. One is, what is the agenda of the organization? So, for example, I'll give you a quick example. Last year, I gave a CLE talk for a global law firm. So they had me do one time zone for China and Asia and another time zone for the United States. And I thought, oh, I'm some kind of hot shot, I'm doing this big presentation. So we started out with me agreeing to do 1 hour on these different topics. Then it got shortened to 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And then it got shortened to
Mm.
20 minutes. And they said, Dan, we want you to do 20 minutes, but all the same topics. And
Mm.
so I guess what I'm trying to say is some organizations trying to understand the agenda or their culture, where they're coming from, because I think sadly for that organization, it was checking the box, right? Like, we care about this, we care about, but well, we're doing this, but not so much. And I tell them all the time, you're not fooling anybody.
Yeah.
People at the firms, the organizations, the law students, they know what's going on. So I guess my point is, and some organizations are very progressive and they really want to help and they do want trainings and things like that. So what I'm saying is basically, I always think we have to know who our audience is and really be mindful of that because I think with training, it's connecting, you know. So for me, what I've been doing lately in my job for the New York State court system is going throughout the state, showing those films as a way, they're short films, and I use it as a form of storytelling. And then after the story, I get into the details and, you know, maybe some ideas, some skills, some things that are helpful, some that are not so helpful. So, but it's knowing who the audience is and trying my best to connect with that, you know.
I totally agree. And I've had that exact same experience where I'll be invited to something and then the time just keeps getting shortened and shortened. And yeah, I call it putting a band-aid on a broken arm, right? Because
It's
we are
true.
not, yeah, we're not actually able to do anything. And something else that you said that sparked for me is that one of the things that I've been offering a lot more is these story sharing circles because again, I think that these spaces where we can actually share our experiences, number one, helps to remove the stigma. Number two, helps to remove the loneliness because we realize, oh, other people are also experiencing something similar. It's not just me. And it creates this sense of common humanity. And so the more that we can integrate that into our spaces, and then I just want to add, Cam, you said uh, that I think each of you are bringing the reality that metrics are less important than looking at individual cases. And the thing is, here's the reality: is metrics are a reality, right? We need metrics. We need metrics to measure against for for different reasons and whatnot. The point that I make is in my work is that uh, well-being should be at an equal level to metrics in terms of policy and decision making. So anytime we're creating policy around metrics and productivity and everything else, well-being needs to be in that same conversation so that's the thing. So it's not that metrics are less important. I think metrics, we're never going to get away from them, right? That's just a reality of the world that we live in. But I think again, it's those of us who have a voice to be advocating to bring the other part up to match that, because I think we're at this inflection point now that I'm hoping that people will start to see the necessity more, but I think we need more of us saying this out loud so that we can shift that.
And that's why I think it's important that all three of you came on this program. People are, I think, appreciating what you've done. Somebody suggested having a required CLE in all states. And again, somebody said thank you for creating the platforms to help. All of your stories were insightful, moving. I really appreciate everything you've done. Zeno also, best of luck. He is taking the bar next week. So thank you for taking the time to spend with us. And I know after this, you're going to get back to your studying. But again, thank you all for joining us. Again, incredibly insightful comments. And I think, and I know that you've reached and touched somebody who I think is going to get the help that they need. And also, again, your stories were very inspiring. And I appreciate all the work you do. I did put the websites into the chat feature, so hopefully people can see those. And again, Roots in the Cloud, the Depression Project, the Just Us movement. So you can, I'm sure, reach out to Dimple, Zeno, or Dan in terms of getting in touch with them. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you. I appreciate it. Getting some thank yous in there. It was
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thanks
Thanks.
for having us.
All right. Heart, heart, somebody said. All right. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Thanks for
Thanks.
sharing, Dimple and Zeno.
Likewise, likewise.
Absolutely, it was
You
a
were
pleasure.
amazing.
Bye bye.
All right. Bye.
Bye.